I thought it would be worth talking about some specific words that we use to talk about our predicament and collapse, and to just share my personal thoughts about them because, for whatever reason, I pay a lot of attention to it. So, starting out with this quote that I like from Dugald Hine: "It matters which world we think is ending, and it matters what we tell each other is worth doing at such a time." I guess it might be fair to say that multiple worlds are ending at once, and we don't necessarily, by we I mean like the most of the public, the average person doesn't understand the extent to which they are all entangled. And so what I have included here are headlines that refer to civilization, because our focus oftentimes, and by our in this case I mean the media's focus is on what is going to happen to civilization. And it seems to me that the way that a lot of people see civilization is that it is this potentially innocent thing, represented here by this, I put a wig in Nike, and it's simply afflicted by some bad actors. So whether that is fossil fuels or plastics and corporate elites and maybe Republicans who want to strike down environmental rules or whatever. And well, I said corporate elites, so like capitalism. But we think that underneath all that, like those are just some layers. But once we peel those back, then we'll be left with something that can potentially be good. And we see civilization, and particularly like the institutions that it produces, as being desirable and something that everyone is collectively proud of on behalf of our species. And just to make a point here as well, I have, this better world that this article is imagining is one that is covered in solar panels. But I think a better way to view civilization is what is depicted here. So first, on the left, we have America. While there were humans here, but not representatives of a civilization. So it's not that there were no humans, there were, but they were behaving differently than a civilization does. And then on the right, I have ancient Egypt, modern day Tokyo, and the Amazon rainforest being deforested, because when a civilization emerges, what allows it to emerge and then what its existence perpetuates is a massive scale of resource extraction, whether that's on a regional scale or now on a global scale. Sometimes I wonder whether it might be helpful for some people if I explain it in terms of like how weird it would be if bears or crabs started doing to the planet what we are and seeking to live the way that we do, supported by all the complex supply chains and ultra specializations of roles within the economy and just all the bells and whistles that civilization comes with, not just during modernity, especially during modernity, but also in ancient cultures as well, that organize themselves in a way that could be considered a civilization. So what I have screenshot here are images from the short film Pig, which I will link in the description. It's only a few minutes long, and I really encourage you to go watch it because it shows, like it says here, societal collapse, but the characters in it are non-human animals. And it's kind of eye-opening to see other animals in the position that we are in within a civilization and see how ridiculous all the activities that we are engaged in are. Another thing that I've noticed, like recently on Reddit, is that sometimes people will post and be like, why aren't people getting radicalized by this information about climate change? What we need is some kind of revolution to topple the existing order. And I think part of that statement is motivated by distress over what they're seeing happening to the natural world. But I think it's also coming from a place of seeing our infrastructure and our way of life being threatened. Like, what motivates people to assert that we need a revolution is because they see a lot of the things that they depend on to survive going away, and they think that if we have a revolution, they assume that afterwards we would get to keep things like supermarkets and refrigerators and electricity and running water. But then actually, that's part of the machine that is destroying the planet. And that's what we don't realize. We don't realize that we think that we just need to tame the machine and crank it down a notch, when in fact, the entire thing is the problem. And so technically, a revolution that we're actually aspiring to genuinely relieve the planet of the impact that human civilization is having would actually have to like scrap the whole thing. And I have pictured here on the right the images that I used in one of my more recent videos where I was explaining why a civilization always self-destructs, along with the picture that I use in my analogy for this thing with these valves that metabolizes resources. And so, yes, I think that that is absent from our understanding when people say what we need is a revolution, and when they express frustration and impatience with people for not yet launching that revolution. On to overpopulation. So I do agree that our species faces a state of overpopulation. There are more of us than the planet is going to be able to support much longer. However, I disagree with how people talk about it. So the first one is that oftentimes like people latch on to this one issue and they identify it as a cause of all of our problems, whereas I just see it as a symptom. And so what is actually the cause is our method of obtaining food. It's this type of agriculture that we practice, which allows for the accumulation of surplus. And then because you have access to all those calories, you see the population rise and so on and so forth. And then all of the other forms of damage follows. But you really need that first trigger to unleash the rest. And that's like a basic ecological concept for any species. Like, it needs to access those abundant calories before it can get into any other type of trouble. And I feel like that remains our blind spot. Like, for all of the ways that we identify problems with the current system, we never backtrack that far to like the real origin of this flow. And so even though nobody is going to listen to me, I think it's still worthwhile to identify that, the agricultural method as the origin of all of the other issues that follow, including the state of overpopulation. And then secondly, when people suggest that a voluntary reduction in the population would be like a solution or would be helpful, I wonder what problem they think it would solve or what question they think it answers. Because yes, fewer humans on the planet would relieve the pressure that we're placing on it, especially if it's humans who would be higher consuming ones. However, if you are suggesting that it would help us hold on to what we're used to as normal, no, it wouldn't, because the whole point of like the fact that we face a predicament as a civilization is that our status quo is not one that can ever become permanent. So it's not a solution to the problem of civilization collapse, because there is no solution to the problem of civilization collapse. And when people propose that it would work, well, then actually what you'd see, and this is why I included this human population graph, is like before the industrial era, there were way fewer humans on the planet, and yet you still saw civilizations rising and falling. So the issue just goes from being one on a global scale to being limited to just like a region here, a region there, whatever, but you still see the civilization decimating their environment, because this still comes down to the relationship that the society has with its environment and the way that it goes about meeting its basic needs. This next one did not originally occur to me. It actually comes from Jem Bendel, but he was saying that polycrisis is kind of a weak term. And it reminds me of what I was saying in one of my other videos about steady dystopia. Like, we think that a lot of things are bad, but polycrisis in itself doesn't quite acknowledge that not only are they bad, but also we can't solve all of them, we won't, and things are going to get worse. Polycrisis still sounds solvable, which is why he prefers to say collapse. But then also I realized I don't necessarily like the term collapse, because you've probably experienced this, that like everyone is using it these days. It's in so many headlines. And then on like Collapse Reddit, when you submit a link, you have to include a submission statement where you explain how this is relevant to the topic of collapse. But like anything can be justified as being related to collapse, especially if we don't all agree on the definition. I don't think we all agree on a definition. And of course, you know, you could argue that like, well, do we have to? Like, is that the most important thing? But I think that if it's kind of going the way of the term sustainability. Like, if you could say that, well, things were always bad for someone at some point in civilization's history. And so if the bad conditions and the deterioration is something that kind of like extends forever in both directions on the timeline, it has no start, no beginning. And like, what kind of a category is that for talking about anything? And so another thing that I don't love is when debates start to talk about either human extinction or like the end of the world, because those are such extreme terms. And so I think that when people get into disputes about that, it's like, okay, but even if people don't go extinct, and they will get really, really bad for us. So rather than getting distracted by debating whether or not every last human is going to be wiped off the face of the earth by the end of this century or whenever, there's other proximate and more and definitely more guaranteed things that we could be talking about. And I think that actually it is almost like a defense mechanism for people, or I always wonder when people are concerned about human extinction, I'm like, well, what I'm worried about is my own suffering. And aren't you? Isn't that the thing that is extinction the thing that's really keeps you up at night? Because I don't know what's going to happen to people after I die anyway. So like, how is that even of concern? So sometimes I just wonder whether we talk about that instead of saying that the thing that we're actually scared of is our own suffering that is going to occur between now and the time of our deaths. The next term I wanted to talk about is post-growth. So I get this on my LinkedIn, I follow them, but it seems to be inspired by the limits to growth study and an acknowledgement that growth cannot continue forever on a finite planet. But then it seems to kind of soft pedal on what the implications of that are, because in the limits to growth, the message is growth. It's not followed by a plateau of economy and population, all that. It's followed by collapse. Like everything, agricultural output, industrial output, population, those things are all going to go down. And I feel like it's kind of like putting on blinkers to that and just being like, no, but just like growth is going to stop, and stop thinking about it there. And I also thought it was amusing that the jobs that they advertise are like research positions, internships, director. Like these are all white collar jobs that exist during modernity. Whereas once the empire starts to crumble, the types of work to be done, if you could even consider it a job or a career, more just like the stuff that people are going to be involved in, is like much more essential tasks. And so I thought it was just interesting that they assume that it's implicit when you say that someone's post-growth career is going to be as something like a director of some department. You're assuming that infrastructure remains functional and that we stay in our ultra specialized roles and that electricity remains reliable because presumably these people are working on computers and the internet. So yeah, that doesn't seem compatible with a realistic view of what the decades ahead are going to be. Which is why I also have a picture here of an actual post-globe job, subsistence farming. And then also this term evolve, it sounds like like the collapse of civilization is like some kind of yoga retreat. Individuals don't evolve, populations do, right? So the way actual evolution works is the conditions in the environment are, some particular way. Certain members of the species are better adapted, they survive and reproduce, the other ones don't, and then the ones that survive and reproduce pass along their genes and their features, but also taught behaviors. And then over generations, the whole species can be said to evolve, but an individual can't evolve. And I just don't like that. I think it's one thing to say that, like, to have a certain aspiration for like what type of person you want to be as collapse proceeds. But to kind of pitch it as humanity's opportunity to transcend to a higher level of existence is just a little bit icky. I also think it's popular now to say that, well, we should look to indigenous communities for how to get through this because they've survived it before. And I think that, like on the one hand, true, but that's also missing a few important things. Like, first of all, one way that this is not like that is that for them, the enemy was external, and here the calls are coming from inside the building. And we don't see that about ourselves yet, which is why it's just silly that we think that the enemy is some sub-part of society or of our civilization that we can just draw a line around and crop it out, and then everything else we can hold on to normal. Another thing is that they had skills. They knew how to live off the land, whereas a lot of humans either lack the skills entirely and are totally like urban and we're all domesticated, or maybe it wasn't too long ago that they had those skills, but at this point the land that they live on is depleted, climate is too extreme, or like the population of their region has gotten so high that it just isn't going to be feasible for them to live off of the land. Another one is that a lot of people also like died during the genocide of people who were here before the settlers arrived, right? So to be like, they got through it before, so that means we can get through it too. And it's like, yeah, but they didn't all get through it. And also like carrying capacity, both the numerator and the denominator. So in terms of, well, I kind of made this point already with the applying the skills to the land, but like there were also fewer humans before in all previous ages, and the land, the soil, the water, the climate was more stable. Everything was a little bit purer and not degraded and polluted. And so the number on the top of the fraction is higher, and the number on the bottom of the fraction in terms of like land that can really support population is lower. And so that math doesn't work out as well for us this time around. Next up, some more things that I see in headlines. First of all is this idea like, if we don't. So for example, if we don't curb emissions, then our way of life won't continue. And of course, the flaw or the thing that is implied in that argument, which is inaccurate, is that on the flip side, if we do achieve the thing, if we do curb the emissions, then we can and will continue our way of life, which isn't true. And of course, the journalist doesn't know that, so who can blame them? But I do think that, they're slacking. The journalists and all of this, everyone who's talking about these issues, should apply a little more scrutiny to the other side of the coin of that statement, right? So I want to see an article that says, if we do curb emissions, will our way of life continue? Question mark. And another one is this: we need to. And I just hear like activists and stuff talking about that, and I feel like it starts to turn into this talking point. We need to get to net zero by 2030. And I wonder how many people who talk about that think about what the origin of that statement is, right? Because it's a prescriptive statement, but it's based on the expectation that it'll achieve something. I looked it up once for a friend. It came out of an IPCC report in like 2019. And basically they gave us a carbon budget where like, if we burn this many more gigatons of CO2, or if we cap ourselves at this many more, then we could theoretically stay below 2C. And if you gave yourself a budget for CO2 emissions that starts in 2019 when they originally made that statement, then they visualized how like you can have a declining budget each year of CO2 emissions that results in reaching zero by 2030. So they gave themselves this 10-year timeline. It's like a wedge that gets narrower and narrower. And clearly we aren't doing that. We aren't giving ourselves a carbon dioxide emissions budget or decreasing the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. We are increasing. And I think it would be helpful for us to think realistically if instead of still talking in terms of net zero 2030, we would kind of rewind to the if-then statement that comes before that, which is that, well, if we burn this many gigatons, then this is the amount of heating that's locked in. I feel like that's the more relevant thing to keep in mind, but by pushing that away, we no longer have to think about consequences, and we can only just keep insisting on the strategy to avoid the consequences, even beyond the point where it's kind of relevant anymore. And then, of course, I have a problem with the word sustainability, as does everyone in this sphere, probably because it's so misused. And the way that I think about it, I like the way that actually Václav Smil defined it, which is that it's not like a yes or no question. Like you can't say, I don't know, I get ads for this mattress company. It's Avocado Mattresses, and they claim that their product is sustainable. But a mattress isn't either sustainable or not. It's not a yes, no. It's a like for how long? Because nothing can be sustained forever. Eventually, for example, on planet Earth, the sun is going to explode. And so that will be the end of all the things here. And so it's just a question of how long they hold on between now and then. So it would be interesting if instead of just asking, is this product sustainable, or is this routine of ours, this way of life sustainable, if we were to ask, well, how long is this sustainable? And then I think that's a more challenging question, because suddenly you have to come up with a number. You can't say forever. So you have to say either 1 more year or 5 more or 100 more. And then you have to defend that. And in defending that, you have to take into account a lot of factors. And I think if the mattress company were asked to defend why they think that their product can last for another, that they'll actually be able to continue selling it, right? It's more like, is the company going to even continue running forever? But also the mattresses. I don't think that once you really think about it, it's like, really? Is it going to make it through? I mean, the mattress might, but is the company going to make it through economic decline and climate change and global conflict and probably more pandemics? I don't think so. This next way that we talk about the apocalypse came to my attention as a result of a post that Sterling College shared. It's linked below, but the gist is that within this larger umbrella of the white race, there were ethnicities that did not operate the way that the dominant culture did, or the one that we're familiar with now. They had a different relationship with their environment. They were not all about extraction and expansion. They did not seek to establish empires or civilizations. And so the relevance to this video would be that if the question that we're trying to answer is, why is everything falling apart? Our inclination is to use the framework that, for the most part, fits really well to explain a lot of things. So we look at stuff through, race explains privilege these days. It's also the way that we currently see civilization being imposed by the Western world. And, when we talk about the global North extracting resources from the global South, it is how it is manifesting this time around. But if we limit ourselves to considering that, we might not get the whole picture or the whole answer to this question. Whereas, if we are genuinely looking to answer the question of why is everything falling apart, a better way to look at it, rather than along racial lines, would be along the lines of how does the human society interact with its environment? Specifically, has it sought to establish an empire, a civilization? Is it oriented around extraction and expansion? And in that case, when we define what is problematic that way, then it suddenly takes into account all these other cultures that have existed in other parts of the world and formed civilizations that were also not a good long-term strategy for survival. And what it also implies, once we internalize that, is that the total human population is not going to make the kind of changes that would be required to stop things from falling apart, because that would mean stopping operating as a civilization or an empire, dissolving nation states, dismantling corporations, all of that. And of course, we aren't going to do that, which means we are simply going to continue engaging in this world-ending behavior. And so, I think one place where I see that mistake made is with proponents of degrowth. They use this phrase contraction and convergence. And what they mean is they say that if the global North were to crank its consumption down, we could also crank the South's consumption up, and then we kind of meet at the middle and live happily ever after. But that still relies on this mistaken reasoning that there's nothing wrong with the empire in general. It's invisible in that analysis. And another set of terms that often come up in these types of discussions that I don't love are developed and developing. First of all, because they imply that a state of developedness is the end point for everyone, that it makes sense, it's a good thing as an end point, and that it is also not only good and desirable, but feasible. Whereas the reality, and it also implies that developed countries have achieved that point, and then developing countries are behind, whereas the other ones are ahead, but we're all headed towards that. That's the end of the race. Whereas the reality is that no society is going to be able to hold on to their developedness. We will all be de-developing in the near future. And so it forces this mind shift from believing that the global North is kind of at least somewhat the example of, or at least a developed state is the example to which everyone should aspire, toward understanding that actually the current living conditions of developing nations is what the future holds for currently developed countries. And the other problem is that it completely disregards any part of the planet and any human society that is choosing to remain undeveloped. They don't get any kind of consideration. It is almost as if their way of life is less legitimate. We acknowledge their existence, but we don't really take seriously the perspectives or, the way that those people live who have no interest in becoming either developing or eventually developed, and who see that as undesirable. Another one is, Jeremy came up with this word, but it's tolerenewablating. Correction to this concept of tolerenewablation that Jeremy coined. He didn't mean to
tolerate the idea that clean energy is a thing. He has a talk against techno-optimism, which I will link below. But what he meant was that if you encounter someone who is at that point in their learning process where they still think that clean energy is a thing, that you should challenge the idea, but have patience with them and realize that you're not going to change their mind by arguing at that point, and just focus on whatever projects it is that you can agree on.
Nate Higgins talks about having, let me see, what is it? Pre-existing conditions, like setting up the pre-existing conditions, having conversations with people where we are starting to wake up to how difficult the future is going to be. And if you just kind of allow people to believe that we will have industrial energy and electricity in the future, you're missing an opportunity. What you could be doing instead is challenging that idea. And if you challenge that idea, then suddenly you could generate a whole lot more like sense of urgency around the need to build resilience, instead of just kind of coddling them and allowing them to believe that they will continue to benefit from electricity, because that's a real game changer. Another one is sometimes the argument is, well, things like clean energy coupled with degrowth, that's like training wheels for someone. And in fact, Rachel Donald and Max Wilbert talk about this in their episode on Planet Critical, that it's kind of like a gateway. Like you start by learning about degrowth and then assuming that there'll be clean energy, but then as you kind of look into it, naturally you realize that that's not going to be feasible. However, in practice, I don't see it working that way. It seems like people get a taste of degrowth plus clean energy, and then they just cling to that. We see that in Rachel Donald's response to her conversation with Max Wilbert. Like, she briefly considers that we might actually not have industrialism in the future, but then like backtracks on it. And finally, I think that it makes unfair excuses for the empire. So like I have here, Solarpunk tells us that empire doesn't have to be atrocious. It doesn't have to be hierarchical or extractive. So like somehow we could have all the benefits of industrialism, because like clean energy does involve industrial infrastructure and electricity, and then the manufacture of all the things that run on electricity. Somehow we can have that. And in fact, not just the global north, but everyone around the planet can have that. And yet somehow, without it being a cost to our natural world, right? And that's like scientifically untrue, physically impossible. And then also it's unrealistic, and it's just buying them time. So what I mean is, here I have a picture from this trailer, Welcome to Sodom. It is of this place in Ghana where all of our e-waste goes to decay. And it's like, are you really telling me that the authorities are claiming that the people who live here, when you see this trailer, are one day going to enjoy a hot, delicious meal and clean water and a nice shower and a comfortable bed, every single one of them as part of their everyday life, the way that we have here in the global north, for now? It clearly seems untrue. And so when Rachel said of her talk with Max Wilbert that she almost said it's like kind of racist to abandon hope that we would be able to lift the global south out of poverty. But actually, when you realize that, like, no, the imperial system is going to fail to do that no matter what, then what follows is that by insisting that the imperial system actually might succeed in delivering that, and is capable or whatever, the only entities that you're helping are the elites at the top of it. You aren't helping the people that are in need, who are living in these conditions, because they're not going to get that outcome no matter what. And so by continuing to encourage people to have faith in the system, you're really just, it's serving as propaganda for the system, for as long as people are able to actually believe that it's on their side. And I just wanted to read some things from my paper that I wrote for my ethics class about this. First, I quoted Hospicing Modernity and her Beyond Reform lens, which sees colonialism as having as its constitutive underside modernity. And then I wrote, underpinning modernity is the trade in question, founded on economic specialization and long-distance supply chains. These networks and processes require and facilitate a collective human metabolism that Earth cannot support indefinitely. Even the UN Development Program has acknowledged that, and here's a quote, no country has achieved a very high Human Development Index value without contributing heavily to pressures driving dangerous planetary change. Our pursuit of development has neglected our embeddedness in nature, leading to new threats as a byproduct of development. New health threats, increased food insecurity, and more frequent disasters, among many others. So, like, the UN is admitting that, like, we can't pursue development without shooting ourselves in the foot. And this solar punk is just some kind of, like, weird fantasy that insists that development can be a final fixed state. Also, I have that, these people who work for NGOs that suggest that through participation in the major trade systems that the global south and the most, the lowest GDP countries can lift themselves up, are just making empty promises, peddling a vision of a world in which all producers can enjoy secure and sustainable livelihood. They're broadcasting the types of platitudes that temporarily, and this is another quote from Hospicing Modernity, give people a sense of hope and of moving forward, where they are the ones guiding humanity to a better place and justifying their privilege with their benevolence and purpose. And just to call attention to how ridiculous this is, I have some headlines here from the World Bank Group. So first they have the role of trade in ending poverty. But wait, hold on, because they've also said in this past, in 2024, ending poverty for half the world could take more than a century. So it's like, no, we promise your life is going to change for the better, but just try to check back with us in, like, I don't know, mid 2100s, as if, like, what is even going to be standing then? And then also a report from The Guardian says that wars, debt, climate crisis, and COVID have halted the anti-poverty fight. So originally, the sustainable development goals said that they were going to eradicate extreme poverty, and this goal was set in 2015, and they had said by 2030 we're going to get rid of extreme poverty. And of course now they're just asking for an extension. So you tell me, do they deserve an extension? And another term that I take issue with, believe it or not, is doomer, because I think that people who don't see things our way use it dismissively. They see us as party poopers who just need a pep talk. And you can see that here in this article that I clipped from a Yale publication. And I know that there are opinions out there that actually it's better to embrace a term when the other side tries to use it against you, you just take it back. But when I look at the way that the world is going, I see all these marginalized groups having more and more rights taken away. And the other side is not being convinced to see them differently simply because they took back a term. If there's examples of it working, let me know, but definitely not right now in America. So I have an analogy to explain why I think that people see the doomer view this way. Imagine that we are at a rooftop party on a high-rise building, and someone proposes that, okay, well, now I'm going to go leap off and fly. And if you were to suggest that they're crazy, everyone else would believe you, and they would think that that person's unreasonable. And that's because we all have a sense of gravity. Whereas, imagine now in this scenario that everyone spends so much time inside playing virtual reality games that they actually no longer have a sense of gravity. They have no sense of real life, cause and effect, action and consequence. And so then, in that world, if they briefly take their goggles off to go outside and mingle, if that person were then to suggest that they're going to jump off, and if you were to tell them, I think that that's going to end badly for you, everyone else would accuse you of being, having a morbid obsession with death and being cruel. And what, do you just hate people? You must hate people. Or maybe you're just having a bad day and you're feeling grumpy and you just want to put other people down and tell them that their ideas are silly or whatever. Um, and that's because they have no physical reality. They have none of their judgments or their assessments of an idea can be based in physical reality because they have so little experience of it. So instead, they're left to rely on like gut feelings and like the vibe of a statement. And that's what I see happening, I think, in civilization now. Every civilization serves to separate the human inhabitants from their environment. But this modern civilization does that more than any other. And so it is actually possible for those of us who are living connected to it now and who grow up in it to have no real sense of like what the outside world is like. And it's actually easy, especially if you're in the global north, to believe that you can have all the things you have that we have taken without that ever incurring any consequences. Like you can have action without reaction, which is absurd, but that's actually this virtual world that we're living in. We spend so much time in our own minds and in our imaginations. So I don't have an alternative in mind yet, but what I feel like would gain traction, and of course I don't expect most people to like change their minds or see things differently, but I think that for my own satisfaction, I would prefer to focus on not the conclusion that things are doomed, but on the rationale that gets us there. Because they have a good point. Those other people have a good point that actually, for some people, a hatred of the current world and hatred of people and being in a grumpy mood could actually lead you to being a doomer. And I think that certain doomers are that way. But then there's those of us who arrive at this conclusion after considering a lot of things, after experiencing a lot of things, after looking at all the data and looking at what we can easily observe about human behavior and what we've set ourselves up for. And that's what leads you to that conclusion, is like a commitment to being realistic and rational. And so I think that if somehow we were to take a step back and instead of putting the emphasis on the conclusion and instead put it on the process, then that would at least get more attention to that. Like then that's what people would have to be responding to. And then how do they respond to that? And that kind of shifts the conversation. Again, maybe it doesn't. I'm not that hopeful. But and then it would reveal that the other side actually doesn't, their rationale is pretty flimsy. So of course, I can't tell you all these words that I don't like without suggesting some that we could be using. So what I've realized I do like, for example, is empire, as opposed to the term civilization, because like the point that I made at the beginning of these slides, civilization is kind of a positive or even just neutral term. Like we associate it as being something good, and it's something that we're proud of, and it's man's greatest achievements that we have all these big civilizations and science and discovery and a particular type of art. And whereas if you say empire, then it becomes a little bit clear that it is this extractive way of organizing ourselves. Its goal is resource extraction, and it is unstable, a little bit fragile, constantly jeopardized as a result of the problems that it creates for itself, right? Like I think of those are the ideas that we associate with the word empire. So I think I might, like in future conversation with normies, slip that in place of the word civilization if the topic ever turns to anything relevant, and see how people respond. Another one is I like to talk about like we're temporarily maintaining developedness, and also the word de-developing, because that is the process that we will be undergoing in the future. It is a cyclical track that we are on, not a linear one. And then also quantitative contraction and qualitative deterioration. So instead of saying just collapse, the country's going to experience collapse. I think it would be better to talk in terms of, well, there is going to be less of this thing, or performing this activity is going to become more difficult, right? And be a little bit more specific what we mean. And then also, here's a phrase that I liked: a directionally downward and inward movement with some lurches. And that I got from this post. I've showed the picture, like the banner from it here. It's called Vocabulary for Our Time. I will link it below, but it is written by someone who is, I guess he's on the staff at Sterling College. It's a pretty good post, so check that out.